This video is brought to you by Blessed Be God Boutique, maker of Catholic fashionable apparel, handmade accessories, and more. We often turn to Malachi Martin on this channel to describe the state of things and to turn to him for showing that the current problems in the church were forecast. We knew that they were coming, that many of the problems we see today are actually not new at all, that they came from somewhere and they just developed naturally over time by the presence of the very same bad actors 30 and 40 years ago who are still there today, as well as their ideological children. Today we do something a little different. We turn to Father Malachi Martin here in an interview most people have not heard from 1998, not long before he passed away. It's on a radio show, and the host is asking him about the state of the Catholic Church. And Malachi Martin describes it as a deterioration of the Catholic Church. And he's asked how it happened. And Malachi Martin gives him the simple answer. If you understand the history of the church, you do know that what he describes was sort of the inflection point. The errors that were brought forth in what you're about to hear, the way he describes how errors were foisted upon the church, well before the event he describes, were present. Well, if you go back a century and a half before the event that Malachi Martin here describes, you would understand that popes were combating the errors in the church already. They were growing to the point where about 120 years ago, a pope by the name Pius X wrote a landmark encyclical called Pascendi Dominici Gregis to combat these same errors. But the inflection point here is what's most important. And Malachi Martin describes it in ways that will make some people uncomfortable, because he acknowledges that basically every pope of the last 60 years is directly responsible for the growth of these errors in the church, even the ones that he and many of you watching this hold very dear in your hearts. They were all responsible. Here's Malachi Martin on the deterioration of the Catholic Church.
What is going on with the Catholic Church is that the Catholic Church appears to be, and not only appears, but is, a major player in the upcoming, which we hear so much about today. And as we're going to hear from my guest, Father Malachi Martin, in just a moment, there is also another element in this mix that is working in other areas, and we're going to touch upon all of those. And very interesting program. Welcome back, Father.
Okay, thank you.
Now, before we went to break, we were talking about, the deterioration of the Catholic Church, and we were talking about...
As an organization.
As an organization.
Yeah.
Let's talk about why this is occurring.
Yeah. Before we do that, we should make it clear to, at least I should make my mind clear to our listeners, namely that we make a radical distinction between the institutional organization composed of bishops and priests and dioceses and parishes and institutes and schools, the universities and libraries, und so weiter und so fort, as our German cousins say. Between that, the institutional organization, and what we call the mystical body of Christ. And what is that? It is the assemblage of all those in a state of grace, what the Roman Catholics call the state of grace. And they are either in heaven, or they're in purgatory, or they're on earth, and they're observant Catholics.
Okay.
There's a distinction between those two elements that make up the Roman Catholic Church.
Okay.
Now, what is deteriorating is the organization. And the question we've just touched on, the fundamental question is, what has caused it? And my remark was that it's our own doing. It was done by us to us. It was done by three popes, followed by their bishops, to the institutional organization. Why? Because of a meeting held in the 1960s, from 1962 to 1965, where a very clever, parliamentarily sage group of cardinals and bishops, under the prodding of two popes, decided to draw up a blueprint for the Church in the future, which would effectively liquidate the central mystery of Catholicism, which is the Mass, and which would reduce the status of the Pope, and that's the key element, reduce the status of the Pope to the status of the first among equals. And both of those things require explanation, but it was a blueprint drawn up, and it's taken just about 30 years to implement. And John Paul II, Pope John Paul II, the present Pope, he has achieved finally the complete deterioration of the organization itself. Now, you can ask, what is the motive? Why? The motive, I think, is misguided, of course, and was wrong in its calculation.
Mm-hmm.
But there was a great urge in the 60s at that meeting of the bishops. There were 2,800 of them, by the way, gathered in St. Peter's for 3 years.
Now, this is Vatican II you're talking about.
Vatican II, from 1962 to 1965. The spirit amongst them, and fomented by the popes in question, and by the cardinals, and the cardinals are very important officials around the Pope. The spirit amongst them was, at all costs, at all means, let's get with the world. We've been isolated. We're antediluvian. We are not talking to modern man as modern man understands talk. We're not with him in building his habitat. We've been too busy with our own spiritual matters and theological developments and converting people. Let's take a completely different attitude and let's join the world. And let's modernize everything. And the big word that John the 23rd used was aggiornamento, which means bringing things up to date. Now, that was their spirit. And in order to do that, they jettisoned, in the Vatican Council, they jettisoned sacred traditions that had always been traditions in the Catholic Church back to the time of the first popes in the first century. Peter, Linus, Cletus, Clement, and all the others.
Mm-hmm.
They jettisoned those and substituted more modern-sounding doctrines, especially on 2 or 3 capital points. One was about human liberty. The other was about marriage, the meaning of marriage, and the purpose of marriage. A third was concerning the Holy Father, concerning the Pope's authority. On those 3 points, they changed completely the organization of the Church. Now, why did they do it? I think it was a mistaken zeal to belong to the modern world, to catch up with it. And we have caught up with it. You'll find that, but in all normal countries, you'll find always there are 3 components, and only 3. The first important component is the government. Government is terribly important nowadays, much more important than it was for our grandfathers and grandmothers.
Mm-hmm.
And the second component is the business community. And it's in many countries it's more important than the government. It's the fulcrum that moves the whole country.
It's a big thing.
And the third component is what we call that rabble of NGOs, non-governmental organizations. To the Catholic Church and to all the churches, we are just NGOs. And it's a name taken from the United Nations. And we're in the marketplace. We're no longer consulted, especially by anybody. No church is. Religion has very little to do with the way the government is run.
Vatican II did not come out of nowhere. The way Vatican II happened was that men who should not have been in the priesthood, men who were assisting bishops and priests, who themselves should not have had access to those bishops and priests and the positions of authority that they had, were able to essentially foist new ideas and new ecclesiology on the church. Ecclesiology being the theological word for the theology of the church. What does the church believe its mission in the world is, and its relationship to the world? These men should never have had the ability to do this in the first place, but they did. And we are reaping the whirlwind for their actions. It's worth noting, again, that these errors had been combated by Pope Gregory XVI in the early 19th century, Pius IX in the mid-19th century, Pius X in the early 20th century, Leo XIII before him, all the way up through Pius XII. a full century and a half of popes were trying to prevent these errors from ever gaining real foothold in the church, and they failed. And now we reap the whirlwind for when those promoters of error would actually finally have the power to do things. And now they act out in the open with no remorse. Let me know what you thought of this in the comments, please. Hit like and subscribe if you haven't. It does help. So does sharing this on social media. It helps too. And as always, pray for the church. I'm Anthony Stine. Ave Maria.